All right. So again, thank you all for joining us today. This is the SLS Economics webinar series as part of the AUD webinar series, which is a very good initiative to keep, uh, to continue our dialogue beyond the regular semesters with the subject as well as with students and the general community around. So this webinar is going to be a part of, it's going to be two-part series. In the first part, I plan to talk about mostly results from the research on economic growth that we know as of today. And as with all social science constructs, this is basically a history of economic growth. There could be multiple ways of telling the story. One advantage of the research that I'll be presenting today, and which many of the students would recognize that I have presented it in the class as well, in bits and pieces, maybe not as a whole story, uh, has has a good amount of econometric analysis backing. So these are not just arguments, but these are based on data. There are formal historical methods that have also been used to uh, figure out what could be the most probable picture that has been there. As most of us are aware, all history is basically a construction, but that doesn't mean that you can tell any story that you want or that you would like to hear, but you have to adhere to norms of analysis, right? What is the evidence? What are the other textual sources saying at that particular point of time? What is data evidence? And if you're really doing hardcore history, what is going to be the archaeological evidence, and so on and so forth. So in economic history, it is primarily the data and clever ways of using data so that we can figure out what are the causal relationships that we are looking at. So here our dependent variable is basically either a level of income of different countries or uh, or basically economic growth rate. In the second part, which is day after tomorrow, I would basically like to present some research that has been done on India in the context of all the research on economic growth that we would talk today. Of course, all of this research has not been done by me. So, in some sense, this is an extension of a regular classroom lecture, but targeted to a larger audience. Uh, and also give a sense of where does the field of research stand today and what are the possible areas of research in future. So that would be the second part where we'll be talking mostly about India and similarities with other developing countries and so on. So what we can do is, my initial plan was to talk about 45, 50 minutes and then open it for questions. But if you have any clarificatory questions, you can stop me in the middle, or you can also type in your question in the chat, so I can take those questions. Otherwise, I'll take a bunch of time to talk about stuff, and then you can ask me questions. So why are some countries rich and others poor? And this question has been bugging me since my college days. I was in college long back ago, probably many of you might have been kids or may not even have been born. This was basically in 1990, 91, 92. I started my college, and these were the heydays of reform. India had gone into the balance of payments crisis, and Manmohan Singh, along with the Prime Minister Narasimha Rao at that time, had initiated a bunch of reforms, which was a part of the conditionality uh, that I'm sorry, I'm going to keep on doing this. Maybe at some point we will just have to stop admitting people. So that's not good. Okay. So there were a bunch of these things that were happening. And of course, there was a lot of debate in the local press, in the national press. There were a lot of things that were people were saying, they were not necessarily always in support of the reforms. There was a rich critique against the reforms. There were also some doubts, some support, and as students also we were quite confused. So there were student organizations on campus making arguments for reforms. There were people making arguments against reforms. There was a Swadeshi movement which was talking about we should renew our Swadeshi movement prior to the which was there prior to the independence and so on. So a lot of things being thrown at students, and these questions therefore very important. I mean, why do we have to do all these reforms? Are these really needed for improvement of life standards and so on? Uh, and the world was also, the research was also not in a state where there was any conclusive answer. The evidence was at best mixed. And so over the years, as I taught these courses uh, in the US, in India, and so on, I have basically gathered a lot of thoughts based on the as the research was being presented over the time, and this is kind of a summary of that. I know there is some research which has gone ahead of this as well, but I can basically show you the direction. So why are some countries rich and others poor? So before we go on, just for the non-specialists, what we are going to talk about, uh, we use real GDP per capita as a measure of welfare, right? So all these words are very important. So what is real GDP per capita? Just a quick overview. It is per person value of new final goods and services produced in a year in a country, measured at prices of a selected base year. So you will have to select a base year for that. So the most important reason why we do that is we want to correct for inflation, because as you go from one year to another year, and if you want to measure production only, then you will have to take out the effect of prices. Otherwise, the nominal GDP figure will rises because of increase in prices as well as increase in quantity, and then you would not know how much of it is because of prices and how much of it is because of quantities. So when we are trying to compare welfare across time and across countries, we will have to arrive at a common measure. And this one common measure that we have is the per capita real GDP, or real GDP per capita. Now, in this particular presentation, instead of there's a typo, that should be real GDP. But I'm just going to keep on saying GDP per capita just to reduce uh, the phrase. But what I always mean is real GDP per capita. We are actually calculating how many apples, bananas, refrigerators, television sets, computers that were produced in a given country in a year. And these are only new and final goods and services that were produced. Okay. Of course, one more thing that becomes important while we do this is uh, if you're doing comparisons within a country, then of course there is no problem. You just choose a base year, and then you get a series of real GDP. You divide it by total population, and you get per capita real GDP. So that's fine. When you go to international comparisons, of course, the main problem is the currencies that we use. Each country has a separate currency, and so if we want to really know or compare countries, then we will have to convert those into one single currency. The norm is to convert it into international US dollars. The thing is that which exchange rate are you going to use? The nominal exchange rate, which, for example, is reported every day in the newspaper, fluctuates a lot. And therefore, your real GDP figures would fluctuate every day, and the ranking would just change. I think it's a good exercise for students to basically do this, just compute real GDP and convert it to international currency using the nominal exchange rate, and you will see how the ranking changes from one day to another change. So that is not something that we want to we want our comparisons to be affected by. So what economists use is called as the purchasing power parity figures or purchasing power parity exchange rate. Now, purchasing power parity exchange rate uses a very simple principle. It basically says that take a representative standardized basket of goods and services in different countries, okay, that an average consumer buys, and evaluate that at the given prices in that particular country, and then convert it and then compare the prices. So let's say, for example, the cost of buying breakfast of, let's say, a standard international breakfast that we can think about, which is omelette, bread, sausages, and whatever you can think about. How much would it cost to buy it, let's say, in United States versus in Germany? And let's say in Germany, it costs you 8 euros. And in United States, it will cost you, let's say, about $10. Then, in terms of parity, 8 euros is equal to $10, and that gives you the exchange rate. So, that is basically called as the purchasing power parity exchange rate. A very simple example, which many of you would know, and if you do not know, it's a good entertaining exercise to do. The international magazine, which is published from the UK, The Economist, computes this Big Mac index, which is because McDonald's is present in almost all the countries now, including India. What you can do is compare the Big Mac prices to arrive at exchange rates. So, for example, in London, if you pay about £3 to buy, or £4, I don't know what the price is, I'm just throwing numbers, £4 to buy a Big Mac. And in India, you're buying a Big Mac, let's say, or the Mac Maharaja that we buy here, at let's say 400 rupees, then £3 is going to be equal to 400 rupees, and that will give you the exchange rate. That's the basic idea that you have. Okay. There are various problems, but I'm not going to go into it. So, just suffice it to say, the Mac Maharaja is basically made of chicken. The Big Mac is actually made up of beef. But uh, leaving those complications aside, this is what you get. So you compute real GDP per capita
Sir, I
figures.
have a question.
Uh, yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So, sir, we know that when the purchasing power parity is computed, there is a common basket of goods that is taken. But sir, isn't that idea of purchasing power parity like intrinsically flawed, because the basket of goods which say might be important or might be taken to compute the purchasing power parity in the countries that are developed might be quite different from what the consumption structure is in a developing country, say for example India itself.
Right,
So
right,
in
right.
that, so sir, in that case, isn't that a problem in how we are
Yeah, very good
comparing?
question. Okay, very good question. So obviously, economists are smart, and so they have figured an answer to this. So actually, what we do is we use the underlying basket of that country's consumer price index. So India's consumer price index, whatever the basket is, we use that. In UK, it would be consumer price, the basket underlying the consumer price index in UK. Okay, so it's not standardized to represent the same basket everywhere, but the consumer price basket, the basket underlying a consumer price index, gives you the standard commodities that go into purchasing by an average consumer. Okay, so there is a limitation to it. Again, now what is an average consumer? Are we taking urban consumer price index or rural consumer price index? So these are different questions that we have. So in that sense, there is going to be a limitation in terms of how closely can you approximate differences in standards of living. You will have to actually go and see what are the products that consumers think about. There are also quality differences which we may not adjust for, and so on. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So let's go ahead. So we did this calculations, we did purchasing power parity conversions, right? And let's say that now you have all the data for all the country, real GDP per capita in front of you, and you decided to rank these countries according to it. So how does the world inequality look like? And I think this diagram is very, very uh, educative in that perspective, right? So again, these are not the graphs that I have drawn. These are basically collected from various sources. I have said this, I have given the sources there, and the references are also there at the end of the slides. So you will know where I have taken it from. Uh, so uh, somebody who wants to join. Okay. All right. So this is a graph which is, so there are several things that this graph tells you. One is on the x-axis, you have cumulative percentage of world population. And on the y-axis, you have GDP per capita. Now, these are basically 2011 figures, which were computed in constant PPP $2,000. Okay. Now, you will see that we keep on using these. So sometimes we will use 2011 PPP because those years also have to change to keep the consumer basket represented, right? But the ranking does not change much or at all if you change the years, as long as you're using real GDP and PPP conversions. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So clearly, uh, you can see all the rich countries somewhere around here. So 50,000 that is there, and then 50,000 is not the was the topmost income in 2011 using $2,000, 2,000 year dollars, and we have the lowest around $1,000 dollars. Now these are per capita annual figures, right? So think about this as a standard basket that you are buying, and it costs, let's say, $1,000 to buy for an average family. So what it means is that if you are a citizen in Nigeria, then you can buy one such basket, okay? Or you could buy one such basket in 2011. On the other hand, if you were a citizen of China, then you could buy about five such baskets. If you were in India, you could buy about three such baskets. But on the other hand, if you were in United States during that time, then you would have bought about 35 such baskets. Okay. And if you were in Luxembourg, you would have bought 50 of such baskets. So this is one way of looking at the international inequality. So your consumption is phenomenally lower if you are in some of the poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa or in the African continent, and than if you are in a developed world, right? Also, think about the world average at that time, and this hasn't changed much. In fact, now with the pandemic and the other things that are going on, we might be looking or staring at similar figures right now. So this is $10,000 is about the average GDP per capita of the world. And if you see this point here, at this particular point, 80% of the world population is covered. So 80% of the world's population lives approximately at $10,000 or less of income. So the rich world comprises only of 20% of the world's population. So that is a phenomenal change in, or that is phenomenal range of inequality that we are looking at. Okay, so this is a pressing problem for 80% of the population, the standards of living of 80% of the population. And even within the 80% of population, you can see that there is a vast inequality. If you think about Nigeria, or if you think about Niger or Chad, these are countries which are really, really very, very poor. Okay, and if you just apply the rate of rule of 70 to calculate approximate times to double their income, then they would take approximately 2000 years to reach what United States was in 2011. Now mind well that United States is also growing at the same time. Okay, India at today's growth rate would take about 40 years. Okay, 40 to 50 years to reach the level of let's say about 30,000. Let's say about Italy for now. Okay, it's just doubling the income that you have. Our income for now, and I'll come to those figures in a few minutes. But so this is the world inequality. 80% of the world lives less than on less than $10,000 of income. These are purchasing power parity figures. So these are baskets that you could buy, and 20% is the rich world that you talk about. What does history tell us? So just to, because we are going to come back to history again, I want to give this show you this graph as well. One of the glaring facts that we have is that for most of the human existence, about till 1500s, right? And this figure keeps on moving a little bit as people do more research. There is more data that comes to forth, and so it goes back, it comes a little bit ahead. But 1500s, let's say that everybody was poor. Okay. Now, there were big economies. For example, the Indian subcontinent, because there was no India at that time, but there were Indian subcontinent that you had, the Chinese empires that you had, and the North Africa. So these were the regions that were relatively rich, but the difference is not phenomenally glaring. Okay, on an average, human beings have been poor for most of the history that we have. The prosperity, the richness that we are enjoying today, some of us enjoying much more than others, has been a result of the post-industrial revolution figures. So people would basically say that for most of the human history, we were in the Malthusian world, right, where there were technological developments, but that led to significant increase in population, reducing the per capita availability of goods and services. So there was this spurts, but again the per capita availability reduced. Only after the industrial revolution, that too only after 1800s, so we're talking about early 19th century, that's when the standards of living start rising, that too only for some countries, not for everybody. India, you can see it starts rising only after the independence, and substantial rise happens only after 1992. China has a head start over us, and I'll talk about that later. But it's also recent, 20th century, early 20th century that we have. So all these are post-industrial revolution gains. That was the first time when the rate of economic growth was equal to or greater than the population growth rate in the world. And that's when uh, that's when basically the prosperity started increasing. That was the first time in the human history when the consumption basket that we had expanded substantially on an average. Okay. And so we will. So this point here is also called as the point of great divergence, when the divergence between the formerly relatively richer regions like the Indian subcontinent, the Chinese region, and Southeast Asia, Northern Africa, all these uh, fell behind, and the new colonies and the Western world started growing, right? And we will look into, so part of the answers also lie in this great divergence figures that we have. So another look at world inequality. How do you think about this? So we have figures for now. So Angus Madison has been working on collecting GDP figures all over the world for a very long time. And now we have some reliable estimates which go back to about 180, but I'm not going to go back that far. We'll just start from 1820s, right? And you can see how these figures basically compare. So United States, for example, in 1870, United Kingdom had a per capita GDP, okay, which India has approximately in 2010. Okay, so I'll let that sink in. Similarly, in 1820, United States had a per capita GDP of something that, for example, Ghana has in 1970, and there's not much difference now. It still has about in 2010. Haiti, Kenya, many of the African countries that you have. And you also see the growth rates here, right? So, for example, United Kingdom has grown for about 200 years at the rate of 1.23%. And United States has grown at the rate of 1.60% for about 200 years now. These are compounded annual growth rates that we can think about. If you just take the 1920 to 2010 figure, the Western world seems to have grown about on an average of 2%. And the newly growing countries, like, for example, China and South Korea, for example, India still is lagging behind because its growth started only after 1992 and also has slowed down after 2010. Okay. So it hasn't grown for a very long period. Whatever gains that we are seeing in some of the urban centers, right, where we are enjoying a substantial standard of living increase, is the growth of past 2 or 2.5 decades. Okay, but it hasn't been inclusionary. It has basically, to borrow a phrase from couple of researchers from Institute of Economic Growth, it has been growth without inclusion phase. That's what we have here. So there's another thing which you will see in the growth literature is this two types of growth rates. One is called as the cutting edge growth rate. So countries which continuously grow by innovating technology grow at a very smaller percentages of growth rate, like 2%. And countries which grow by physical capital accumulation grow at a much higher growth rate. And I'll come back to that in few moments. So it is mind-boggling, as Bob Lucas put in one of his papers, is that once you start thinking about economic growth and world inequality, there is little else that you can actually think about, right? I mean, what is it that we can do in India, for example, that, so these are, for example, 2018 figures that we have, okay? Using 2011 PPP adjusted constant dollars. This is all publicly available data. This is World Bank has, if you just Google World Bank GDP per capita, you will get all these figures that you have here. So in 2018, India's per capita GDP is about 6,900. So you can think about the earlier example. If a standardized basket costs about $1,000, then Indians today on an average can buy 7 such baskets, compared to, for example, an average Singaporean who could buy 90 such baskets. Yes, I mean, we call United States and United Kingdom developed countries, but those are not exactly the richest countries in the world. The richest countries are basically some of the oil exporting countries. So you have Saudi Arabia uh, and so on. And there's Singapore, there is Luxembourg. And so these are small countries, but they are richer countries, richest countries relative to United States, for example, which is about $55,719. Right? Afghanistan, for example, is 1735. It's much lower than that. Sri Lanka is relatively richer, right? It is, I mean, more than 1.5 times richer than India. China is way ahead. It is more than 2.5 times of India richer. So those people who are talking about overtaking China in few years and so on, that is not going to happen. Because if our growth rate is 5%, right, which is going to be really, really difficult for now. And if you apply the rule of 70, then it is about 14 years for 7,000 to double. So it will become 14,000. So it would take about uh, 14 to 16 years for us to get to China, but by that time, China will also have grown further, right? So that is something that we need to figure out. So how do you think about this? What gives rise to these differences in living standards? And one way of to think about this that economists have developed to think about GDP of a country being produced by an aggregate production function. So you can think about this as a large factory that a country has, which produces all the goods and services that you need by employing three factors. Okay, physical capital, human capital, and the level of technology. Okay, so this is an aggregate production function. I've just given you some uh, one kind of production function here, one possible kind of production function, where I'm basically saying that technology is multiplicative. So whenever there is a higher level of technology, both capital and human capital become more productive. While when you're talking about capital and human capital increases by themselves with a given level of technology, then you basically are looking at diminishing returns. So I'll just tell you what it is. So physical capital, for example, is the stock of tools that we're talking about, machines, buildings, equipment, and so on. Human capital is the productive knowledge and skills that workers acquire through education, training, and experience. And technological knowledge is generally the stock of ideas, the blueprints that we have of producing a particular thing, right? How do you produce a particular commodity or a service? There is some kind of blueprint that countries have developed over a period of time. There is also immense amount of knowledge that is available for free across the internet. So technology, the stock of ideas are generally available and so on. So this large country that uh, the large factory that your country has uses this and produces goods and services. So one simple way of looking at this production function is to think about this line here, right? So this line, as economists would tell you, is that this is an increasing curve, but it increases at a decreasing rate, right? So what happens is the more physical capital stock that you have, you will increase your production definitely, but the increment is going to come only at smaller bits as you have more and more capital stock. If you do not change the human capital and technology simultaneously, the same thing would happen if you are looking at just increasing human capital, right? So if you do not change technology and physical capital, and if you just keep on educating people, right, giving them more education, then of course there will be increase in production. But every subsequent year of education that you have is not going to add as much to the total GDP as before. So human capital and physical capital both have the capacity to increase GDP, but you cannot increase GDP infinitely by just adding to these two inputs by keeping other inputs constant because they're subject to diminishing returns. Okay? The only sustainable source of economic growth that you have is technology. And technology basically shifts the production function up. So if this was your physical capital, in the initial level you produce this much, now you can produce this this much. So it is much higher. So technology allows you to use physical capital and human capital more efficiently in order to produce more. Okay. Now here efficiency, as all the economic students would know, we are talking about uh, a situation where that is the best possible use of those or best possible combination of those inputs. If you move away from that combination, there will be reduction in GDP that we have. So sustained economic growth rate over a long period requires changing in technology. Now again, remember this is a simplified picture because even though we say that technology is the long run source of economic growth, you cannot really separate always technological advances from human capital and physical capital advances. For example, if you get a brand new computer which has all the the fastest processor, the brightest screen that you could think of, then the advanced technology is embodied in the capital stock, right? If you are learning cutting edge science, cutting edge ideas, then the advanced technology is embodied in the human capital itself, right? So it's not always possible to separate out technology from human capital advances and physical capital advances. But in order for us to combine these two inputs to produce more, the technological advances or stock of ideas have to grow phenomenal. Okay. Now just do a thought exercise and you see how important uh, physical capital and technology and these factors of production are, right? So the first row here, what we are looking at is, excuse me, the physical capital stock and human capital that we have in the United States. So let's take that as our benchmark, right? We know there are richer countries, but US is also a large economy. It is one of the biggest trading partners for almost all the countries all across the world. So let's take that as a benchmark. So now this is GDP per worker. So you can have GDP per capita, which is all population, or you can calculate GDP per worker. Here, because we are talking about productivity now, so the worker base is smaller. So obviously the figures are going to be larger. So if you calculate GDP per worker here, then the US has about uh, 1,12,517 Hello. Yeah, sorry, my internet basically went off. So I'm trying with the internet on the phone. So you will have to basically bear with me. Can you guys tell me how far did you hear whatever I was saying about?
Sir, you were basically talking about how we should take the US as the benchmark for comparison in the table with the years of schooling being compared. And
Oh, okay. All right. All right. Okay. Thank you. Okay. All right. Thanks. Yes. I wasn't aware because the screen was full. It was my wife who told me that, oh, you're talking very enthusiastically, but you may not have the internet. So nobody's actually listening to you. Okay. All right. I'm glad we are back. So let me actually present the screen again. All right. Can you guys see the screen again? Am I audible?
yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Okay. And can you see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So, so this is level of schooling difference. So what I'm basically saying was that our level of schooling is way low. And if we even if we have to beat, let's say, our next country, which is China, which has double the uh, PPP adjusted GDP per worker, we will have to significantly increase the level of schooling that we have. And it's not just the level of schooling. We also international tests have proved that students do not read at that level of efficiency either. So there has to be both increase in the extensive margin as well as the intensive margin that we have. So what we are going to so this tells us physical capital and human capital how much we have relative to the United States, right? Our physical capital stock is also very low, and one observation that you can clearly see from this is that lower the physical capital, lower the human capital, lower is your per capita GDP. But what if even with this we give the same level of technology to everybody? How much does the GDP go up by? And that is given to you by the last column here. Okay, so the PPP adjusted GDP per worker if technology were at US level. Okay, so when we say that what is technology at US level, it's basically saying that the stock of ideas is available. People are able to use the stock of ideas that are there. Uh, the ease of doing business is there as much as is there in United States. Anybody who is willing to start a company is able to do that. There are venture capital funds available. Otherwise, they can go to the banks and get the funds, right? And so on and so forth. So all those factors are there, let's say, because technology really is a black box, right? It's really a regression on of GDP per capita as measured on human capital and average and physical capital stock. And the error term is basically the technology, something which we cannot explain, right? So which kind of includes everything that we have. So just by adding those conditions, that is, if we carry out those reforms in India, we would basically get to 24,000 level of GDP, right? Similarly, of course, United States there will be no change because that's a benchmark. UK will increase its GDP to 1 lakh or something like that. So clearly, technology is a big chunk, right? And of course, lot of the technology comes embodied in human capital and physical capital. So if we are not concentrating on that, then of course these things are not going to happen, right? So the first set of answers that we have from us is that why are some nations rich and others poor? Is that because nations have different levels of human capital, physical capital, and technology. Okay, so that's the basic insight that we have by applying the endogenous growth solo model that we have. So this is, excuse me, just for that. So some more figures for you. Clearly, you can see this is the average investment rate from 1960 to 1995. There is a positive correlation between these two lines, significant correlation. A country which had higher investment rate between this period had higher GDP per capita. Similarly, level of schooling. Countries which had higher level of schooling also had higher level of GDP. Right? And you can see how countries neatly line up along with their level of schooling. Right? So broad basing schooling, so improving schooling uh, to all sections of the society, not just urban centers, but rural centers, making massive investments in education is what is needed to actually increase the level of GDP in the country, right? So we cannot be thinking of becoming world leaders without really thinking about education, schooling onwards. I mean, availability of educational institutions per capita in India or in other developing countries which have lower levels of schooling is really very small. Right? So conclusion so far. Rich countries are rich because they have larger stock of physical capital, better educated citizens, and able to generate and use ideas more efficiently than others. Poor countries are poor because they lack on all of these counts. Right? So to know more on this, I mean, we have to now, okay, we have one set of answer, but I guess the next question that we should be asking is why is this the case? Why do countries differ in terms of their ability to accumulate physical capital? Why is an average American able to accumulate physical capital at a such higher level than an average Indian or an average Ghanaian, right? Why are some countries able to educate their populations more than others? Why does an average American get 13 years of education compared to an average Indian of 6 years or an average Liberian of something like 2 or 3 years, right? And why are some people or some populations better equipped to generate ideas, also use the existing stock of ideas more efficiently than others? Because technology is such a thing that it is widely available today, right? If you generally talk about stock of ideas, it's widely available. There are some patterns, but we know patterns are routinely infringed upon, right? And so on. So even outside patents, there is a lot of knowledge which is freely available via internet, for example, for there for everybody to take it. The question is, am I going to be able to use that, right? And what does the population need to use that? It requires ability to actually use that knowledge, right? And so on and so forth. So why are some countries better at this than others? That's the deeper question that we should ask than just accepting that. So I mean, it's so this is where we are. Uh, so I can give about 5 minutes here right now. So just to have any clarificatory questions, and then we can go ahead with some more material right now. So I can take few questions if you have right now. If not, we can continue. All right, you guys can stop me as we go. So today, I'm going to give you a first glimpse at what are the deeper questions that these things refer to, right? So, uh, how to think about this? And I think this is a very good thought framework to think about economic growth. So all the factors that we have talked about right now, which is physical capital, human capital, and technology. Just to check, am I still audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you can see the slides, right? Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is kind of a thought framework that we could think about. So all the factors that we talked about today, which is physical capital, human capital, technology, are the are what the literature has called proximate causes of prosperity. Okay, so think of this as you're flying, you're taking a bird's eye view of different countries, you're talking to different people, right? Seeing their certificates, for example, education certificates, and so on. And immediately, if somebody asks you the question, okay, you flew over New York and you flew over Bombay, what is it that you found, right? And you talk to people and what did you find? So the answer would immediately be, of course, the level of physical capital was different. There are some parts of Bombay which are comparable to New York, but on an average, New York has a much higher level of human capital, physical capital than Bombay. Similarly, people seem much more educated when we look at their educational qualifications, and they seem to be much better at use of technology, use of stock of ideas. So that's why this is called as proximate causes. You can immediately find out by running just some regressions, some data, and so on. The question really is, what are the fundamental causes? What leads to these differences between accumulating these proximate causes, right? Why does India have less human capital and so on? People have advanced a lot of hypotheses and they have done a lot of phenomenal, a lot of uh, research on this, which has informed our understanding of world inequality and its determinants today. And they can be grouped into uh, three broad factors. One is geography, the other is culture, and the third is institutions. Okay, so let's look at these factors one at a time. Okay, so three hypotheses that have been forwarded by this, and some of these hypotheses are even part of the normal discourse, right? I mean, you can think about it as like, of course, Saudi Arabia is the richest country; it has all the oil, right? Of course, this country is going to do better. It has diamond mines and so on. So these are kind of things that we uh, uh, statements that we throw at each other, right? And we think about how far are they true, and what does it mean really, right? So what does geography hypothesis say? So the geography hypothesis proposes that differences in geography, climate, and ecology are the ultimate determinants of large differences in prosperity around the globe. Okay, so these are the determinants. So some countries are rich because the geographies are different. Some countries are rich because climate allows different things to happen more efficiently, or the ecology is such that you are able to do things better than the other countries. So these are kind of things. So, for example, there were a few of the uh, scientists in the colonial era, which talked about that the tropics, and even today, for example, the tropics are kind of doomed because the climate is horrible, it is hot, it is humid, there is malaria, there is dengue fever, and so many things that are happening. I mean, people just don't have time to get educated, to accumulate physical capital, or even to think about technology, right? So, so people in tropics are doomed. That's the usual thing, and You can look at this graph here and you can clearly see, right? So all the countries between the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn are basically the tropical countries, and all of them are doomed. So you have the Southern America, which is relatively poorer compared to the Northern America. Then you have much of the African continent that gets covered between these countries. And then you have, of course, all of India, uh, not all of India, much of India, and then uh, many other countries, and so on. So overall, if I look at this particular graph, this geography hypothesis kind of seems plausible, right? Of course, as an economist, I look at chinks in the armor and I immediately see, oh, this half of Australia is in the tropics, right? Southern India, for example, southern and western India, which is actually richer than the northern and the eastern India, is in the tropics, right? Compared to other countries. So there are part of, for example, the Middle East is basically in the tropics, and so on. So of course, a rough look says that it possibly is true, but if you start looking at what are the arguments that you could throw against this, you can see that there are quite substantial arguments, even just looking at this particular diagram that you have, world map that you have in front of this. So several authors have talked about it. Jeffrey Sachs has been talking about it. So not only colonial scientists, but even today. Jared Diamond has a very well written book, and it's also a movie on Netflix uh, called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And he also basically talks about disease and weather conditions. And some of these are plausible ideas, but I have to point out that Jared Diamond basically talks about this landmass versus this landmass. Okay. And so that kind of makes sense, but it doesn't talk about differences within the landmasses much. There you have. Unfortunately, research shows that there is, at best, inconclusive evidence for geography as a determinant of prosperity. Right. So, for example, people have taken this. Uh, if you look at countries that have severe incidence of malaria, then clearly countries which have the severe incidence of malaria, all of them should be poor. But countries who have this, they belong to both prosperous as well as poor country groups, eluding any systematic relationship between disease and prosperity. In India itself, right? So, for example, many poor states in India are richer in natural resources than the relatively richer states. Bihar has much rich natural resources compared to Maharashtra, for example, right? But Bihar is poorer than Maharashtra. So clearly, just having better weather conditions or better resources, better ecological resources, doesn't really guarantee that you are going to prosper. So there are a lot of chinks in the armor of geography hypothesis. It is at best inconclusive. That's what we can think about, right? So at the international level, even at the level in India that we have. So that's about geography hypothesis. And I would have shown you more graphs if there was time, but let's go ahead more. And then if we have more time, we can think about this. The next hypothesis that has been floating around is, and people have worked on this, is the culture hypothesis. Right? The culture hypothesis proposes that different values and cultural beliefs are the ultimate determinants of the large differences in prosperity around the globe. Examples of cultural differences, you have religious beliefs, family ties, and social norms, right? Sorry, just wanted to see what the time is. Now, there have been a lot of such explanations that have been going around. For example, Max Weber has this famous book where he talks about the Protestant work ethic, where he argues that the Protestant work ethic was responsible for prosperity of some of the Western countries that we have. Samuel Huntington wrote this thesis about the clash of civilization, where he was basically talking about understanding the post Cold War phenomena uh, as clash of civilization between primarily between West and the Islamic civilization, and the West dominated because of superior civilizational values leading to prosperity. Even within countries, we know that there is a dominant discourse today in several countries where there is a supremacy of the majority religion that is to be reestablished so that we can ensure progress and end all evils in the society. So these seem to be some cultural explanations that have been forwarded so far. What does the research say about? And I'll show you a couple of figures that we have, right? But let's kind of poke some holes in these arguments, right? So, for example, if you think that a particular religious population, if you have in that country, the country would be more prosperous. So, for example, if you have more Protestant population, then Max Weber says that's a guarantee to prosperity, for example. But clearly, there is again no systematic relationship. People have run and done analysis with the data, and I'll show you a graph in just a few minutes. Am I showing you? Yes. So if I just look at this graph here, so what I'm doing here is percentage of population that is Protestant in 1900s, and I'm ranking real GDP per capita in 2010. So the idea is that if Max Weber was right, then countries which had Protestant population, significant Protestant population in 1900s, and continued to have that, would be the ones which would be prosperous. Now, if I just look at this particular section of the graph, Max Weber would be very happy in his grave. But of course, the biggest chink in the armor is that majority of the countries bunch up on this particular axis, right? Which basically says that there are host of poor countries and richer countries which form the majority of the world population, right? Which have no Protestant population at all, or very few Protestants that they had. And of course, they're rich as well as poor, so there is no significant correlation between them. So clearly, that makes Weber unhappy, and also, I mean, punctures the geography hypothesis a little bit. Clash of civilizations. So if West was to dominate because of superior civilizational values, then the countries which have higher Muslim population in 1900s and continue to have them would have a higher real per capita GDP in 2010. That's a long period, right? So we want to look at long period because these are explanations for the long run. These are deeper factors, okay, that allow us to accumulate higher human capital, higher physical capital, higher level of technology, and so on. So we're taking a very long period that's for now. Clearly, if I look at this particular graph, at best I can say that, okay, there is a small possibility that the growth rate has reduced or the level of real GDP is less. But again, much of bunching is here. The variance is a lot, right? There is no close bunching towards the line. The line passes merely between two, three observations that you have there. So this is not even inconclusive. Clearly, countries which have higher Muslim population do not guarantee a lower GDP. Most of the countries again are on the x-axis here, right? So clearly, and they belong to rich as well as poor, no systematic relation. So Samuel Huntington was clearly wrong. Okay. So both prosperous and poor countries today are comprised of countries that have either populations that are predominantly Catholic or non-Protestant populations contradicting Weber's thesis. Similarly, countries having predominantly Muslim population also populate both prosperous and poor groups of countries. So no systematic relation. Uh, Pre-independence rate of growth. which was very, very small, minuscule, about 3%, to be because of the fatalistic nature of the Hindu society that we have. Right? Again, I think that's a wrong characterization, because clearly the same group of people, first of all, India is not just Hindu; it is all other religious groups that's there, and this same group of people, where majority of them are Hindus, also produced a substantially higher growth rate later. Right? So all these ideas or markers, identity markers, right, which you basically say that uh, countries belonging to this particular religion, this particular sect, they have a particular outlook towards life, and therefore they either are prosperous or they are poor, does not really bear any water, has no empirical evidence at all. Right? So clearly, this cultural understanding of where we stand today doesn't really hold water unless you're talking about a certain how incentives are shaped by culture, which basically means that uh, your economic organization is more cultural and religious than actually other way around. And so that might be the case in some countries, and I'm going to argue that is certainly the case in of India, right? So clearly, uh, this hypothesis that culture determines prosperity doesn't hold water, and I think the best thing to look at, right, is this map of North Korea and South Korea. So it's a natural experiment, the best natural experiments. If you look at Acemoglu and Robinson's book, Why Nations Fail, it has a lot of these natural experiments where there are two conjoining cities. One is in Southern America, one is in North America. Same population, same geography, same people, because most of the times they are related to each other. They just are in different parts or in different countries, but totally different economic outcomes. Same with North Korea, natural experiment. Before 1940s, Korea was a single country. So same people, same geography, same culture, same language even. So if you think that language is a problem, that was also there. In 1947, the country was split into two countries along the 30th parallel by an agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union. Right? And this is the data that is basically based on the satellite data. There is a very influential paper that came out in a year about a decade ago, which was GDP from outer space. In that, what they did was this US defense satellites, they basically go around the Earth uh, taking pictures of different parts of the countries during night. And this is the light data that has been captured. The hypothesis is that the richer the country, the more the light that is going to be emanated from that country in the night. And then you look at the correlation between the proportion of light emanated with the GDP, and that correlation is really, really very high. So we can rely on this figure, and you can clearly see how these two countries line up. Clearly, North Korea, right? The joke is that this one single light which is emanating from here is probably the palace of the dictator that we have there. And South Korea has a, I mean, abundance of light coming through it. Right? Now, I understand there could be geopolitical explanations as well for this. The point is also that even with geopolitics, people have agency, right? So the question which developmental economists used to ask before: what if we transport all the capital stock that we have in United States, all the technology that we have in United States, in India? Would that make India as rich as United States overnight? And clearly the answer was no, it would not, because, and the answer lies basically in the next hypothesis that we think about. So I don't want to give away the answer, but clearly there is something that the South Koreans are doing which the North Koreans are not, which allows them to accumulate so much brilliance of light emanating from their country in the night, which has been captured by the satellites, which basically means that, and which is borne out by data, South Korea has much higher level of physical capital, human capital, and technology than North Korea. So we need to find out what this is. It is clearly not geography, clearly not culture, because both of these people belong to the same country group just before 1940, right? And I think therein the answer lies also for within country inequality. And therein also lies the answer for what should India do, okay, to actually get to the dream of becoming a, a significant player in the world economy, becoming the biggest economy in the world in the coming decades. So let me stop here right now. The second part of the series of this webinar will deal with India specifically. But before that, we will talk about the third hypothesis, which is the institutions hypothesis, in which, according to me, lies most of the answers in terms of what we should be doing in order to grow and ensure a standard of living to an average Indian and not only a few. Right? Thank you. Am I still audible or did I lose you?
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, still audible.
Okay, 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 all right. So I guess I will stop here for today. So if you have any questions, you can ask. We also started a little bit late.
Sir, I have a question.
Huh.
Sir, amongst the reasons that have been cited about why certain nations are more affluent than the others, sir, most of the
Hmm.
nations that are on the lower end of the growth trajectory are
Hmm.
like do have a colonial history, including India.
Yes.
Sir, why isn't colonialism taken as one of the predominant reasons? Because we know that there was a huge extraction of wealth by all the like Western nations when they colonized
Hmm.
most of these countries, and that is probably one of the reasons why their institutions and physical capital and even other social factors came in, which later proved to be like a big hindrance to their growth.
Right. Okay.
Sir, if
Uh,
I could just,
yeah.
yeah, good morning.
Good morning, Pratishtha. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good. Good. Thanks.
Sir, I'll just add on to that question in the
Hmm.
geographical hypothesis.
Hmm.
Adding to the colonial thing
Hmm.
that he just mentioned,
Hmm.
uh, the resource-rich nations like that, or like those of India and the African nations,
Hmm.
weren't they also doomed because of the same reason? Because
Hmm.
you don't go on and colonize, say, a Western European nation, which is for 6 months it's going to be almost inhabitable, and
Yeah.
in accordance to what you said, which is why Chhattisgarh is also one of the most um, disrupted regions in India.
Right. Right. Okay. So let me address this right now, unless somebody has a question that adds to this question. Okay, so yes, colonialism is going to be one of the factors that we are going to explore in uh, on day after tomorrow, right? It is an important factor, and we are going to link that to the institutions hypothesis that we have. Now, in India, the as I'll argue next time, the answers are a little bit more nuanced than just straightforward uh, that colonialism basically did this or that. We also have to think about what were the existing structures in place when the East India Company started becoming dominant, and later when the English crown took over. So those factors are also important, and they are many. They are also indigenous uh, than uh, than just being colonial. But having said that, uh, we certainly cannot and will not discount colonialism as one of the factor uh, determining economic outcomes today. Okay, so I'm not discounting that, but we will have a way of linking that to how economies are functioning today and how that determines the economic outcomes. Does that answer your question? It is more suspense. I know you will have to wait till uh, Thursday for that, but I promise it will be worth the wait.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, sir.
Hi, Vijay.
Vijay this
Yes.
side.
Hi. Hi.
So I would like to know what kind of data used to study before 1500 to
Uh,
compare nowadays level of income,
uh,
because I think uh, the kind of meaning of living standard in uh, 700, 500 and
yeah.
1000 will be
Yeah.
very little, a lot of difference from today's.
Yeah. 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 Okay. Very good question. So, Angus Madison. So, if you can Google Madison project, okay, you will basically get the links to that. The data is very patchy. As you know, historical records are very patchy, and very few countries had a good data system for that matter. So, for example, in India, the records are very poor. The records are maintained only for a certain section of population, not for all the sections of population. There are mentions of, for example, prices of commodities and services in different administrative documents, but we do not have enough to create a series. Or, for example, there is also this idea that whose data gets researched more, right? So, for example, I know that in Pune, we have so many documents from the Maratha Kingdom period, which nobody has really touched up until now because there is no funding, and who knows what we will get from that, right? So it's also about whether we are interested in actually creating that kind of data sets or not. All this, whatever data has been available, is basically small institutional and individual efforts, mostly from developed countries. So Angus Madison, because he was obsessed with international GDP data, and much of these projects have also been funded by National Science Foundation of the United States. So it's also dependent upon funding availability. It also depends upon geopolitics, which countries people are interested more in. So, for example, because China is a dominant player, you can imagine that a lot of resources go into researching things about China than, let's say, researching things about India or some African country or something like that, right? So, a lot of things right now a state of knowledge that we have right now is limited because data is limited, and whatever limited data that we have has not really been researched to the full extent as well. But given all these limitations, if you look at the Madison Project website, you will see the data series there, and you will also get the caveats. I think the most reliable data that we have for the world economy as such is from 1820 onwards, and not before that.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. So I'm just writing this name here, Angus Madison. All right. Any more questions? You can also email me your questions. I can collect the questions and I can talk about them a little bit later. I can talk about them at the beginning of the next webinar, so that is also possible. So take a time to think about this material, uh, and so on. The video will be uploaded. As soon as I do that, uh, I'll email or I'll ask the IT services to upload the link as well. All right, so I'm assuming that there are not any more questions right now. So thank you everyone for joining today. I know for some of you, there might be a little bit of repetition. Some of you, but overall, I'm hoping that this gives you some good food of thought, and it enriches our general discourse that we have, general discussions that we have with our friends, with our colleagues, and so on, right? So let's stop here, and I'll see you at the same link again on Thursday at 11 o'clock. I've given my email. You can email me for any questions that you have, which I can take it up at the beginning of the next webinar. Thank you.